Somebody's going to introduce me.
Hello! First of all, we are really happy to be here. This is our first time at this show. We typically, for the past 15, 16 years, have gone to the Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas. And we didn't pay too much attention to these other shows, but they're awesome. So I really want to thank the organizers and obviously the attendees of the Portland Retro Gaming Expo for having us. So we're especially excited at the timing of this because we just released our new Intellivision flashback product. And to me, it's really Intellivision reborn. So I could tell some of you remember Intellivision 35 years ago, and some of you were not even born yet. But it's very cool to finally have another product out there with all of the classic games on there, enjoyable by the old fans and the new fans. So here we have Keith Robinson, who was back at Mattel Electronics in 1980 to 84? 81 to 84. So he saw it all and has all the great stories about the early games and pioneering days of video games. And he loves questions and loves stories, and he can speak for all the other Blue Sky Rangers that are usually here. And again, we welcome your feedback and your input and your questions and your stories, or your questions for Keith's stories. So without further ado, Keith Robinson.
Yeah, so this is the first time that I'm talking without all the other Blue Sky Rangers up here, or anybody else up here, so I just will follow my story. Essentially, I'll follow it from before Mattel, why I got into video games and how I got into video games, and then 1982, which was just a fantastic year for video games, and then 1983, which was a terrible year for video games, and crashing down, and then INTV Corporation after came out of that, and then what's happened now for us to start a new company from this. So, I said that for so many people, you know, they kind of grow up knowing what they want to do and everything. The problem was, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a video game designer, because there was no such thing as a video game. When I was growing up, you know, there was no such thing as interactive. I mean, you had a game that had electric interaction. It was like to remove the wrenched, you know, knee from the guy on operation, so his nose wouldn't light up. That was kind of the extent of electronic innovation and interactivity. But when I was in about second or third grade, our school went on a field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry in Los Angeles. And Bell Labs had a display there that was showing optical cable and how this was going to be in the future, things were going to transfer that way. And he went through and all these great little displays. At the very end of it, there was a wall, there was tic-tac-toe. And you could play it, and you could see through this glass wall, all these relays going back, and you could play a game with it. And that's, I think, what got me hooked right there. So, I don't know what year that was, but at the same time, and no one really knew this except people who were at universities and large corporations, there were people creating games on computers, but they were, like I say, they were large mainframe computers that no one had any access to. And it wasn't until the early 70s when someone figured out how to bring that these students were having fun with and bringing it to the average person. And you had Nolan Bushnell, who did it for the arcade machines. And then at the same time, you had Ralph Baer, who was designing it to plug into home devices. And really, you needed both of them because the home devices, people were saying, oh, Magnavox, do you need a Magnavox TV? And it's black and white, does it work on a color TV? No one really knew what this video game thing, this interactive thing was. But then the first game that Nolan Bushnell did was a very complicated game. You know, it's like I remember seeing one at the Hermosa Beach movie theater, putting a quarter in it and dying 2 seconds later or something like that. But boy, that was cool. But it was very complex, and nobody really knew how that worked. So the next thing that they came up with was Pong, which was simple enough that people could understand it, which then, you know, helped with the Odyssey stuff, because now people knew, oh, I would play that at home. And after coming up with the original Odyssey video game system, that had a bunch of games in it, they just started making Pong games. So that's what everybody was doing, was Pong. And was asked one time on a TV show, I said, well, who do you consider the inventor or the father of video games? And Nolan Bushnell with his thing, or Ralph Baer with his? And I said, well, really to me, you need Mount Rushmore, 4 people at least. And you can put Ralph Baer up there, you can put Nolan Bushnell up there, but one of the most important people to me was a guy named Dave Nutting. And who knows Dave Nutting? Okay, there we go. And Dave Nutting was a guy in Chicago and was a consultant to Midway that was doing video games for arcades. They'd done pinball machines and stuff, and they were doing this. And they were licensing them from Japan, from Taito, and there was a game that they brought over, and they were going to sell it in the American market. It was a racing game, and they wanted to put more tracks in it and all this. And Dave Nutting said, you know, if you put one of these new microprocessors in it, it'd be easier you could do it by programming it. And this was the big thing, because when people forget, when they look at the old Odyssey home computer, or the Odyssey home video game system, and all the games that Atari did at the beginning, like Pong and Breakout and all those were not computer-based games. There's no microprocessor, it's hardware. So, you know, the change from hardware to software is what makes the games today possible. These games you see now, these immersive cinematic games, you're not going to do that with the game, with the hardware. You're not going to put together all the NAND gates and NOR gates and all the little op amps and do that. So, to me, when David Nutting said, let's put a microprocessor, it changed the industry from hardware to software. And to me, that deserves a place on Mount Rushmore, because that made my life possible. Because I was, at that time, I was going through college getting a degree in computer science, which also was an unusual thing at the time. UCLA, where I wanted to go, they did not have an undergraduate degree in computer science. They only had a graduate degree. I went to another school, and they didn't have an undergraduate degree. But when I got talking to them, they said, that sounds like a good idea. We'll put one in. We guarantee if you come to our school, start off with an applied mathematics degree, we will have a computer science degree by the time you graduate. And so that's what we did. Because they had a computer, you could actually get there and work on everything. Because as a kid, I liked working with film. I did a lot of movies, I did, cartooning and all sorts of other things, more creative things maybe. But the thing about, at that time, if you want to make a movie, you go down to Sears, you could buy a little wind-up camera and make movies, which I did. If you wanted to draw pictures, you could grab a crayon, draw a picture. But if you want to play with a computer, you couldn't play with a computer. There were no computers around. There was no microcomputers. You had to either study it at a school or go for a job where they were going to have a mainframe computer or a mini computer to play with. So that's why instead of going into film or art, I went into computers, was because of these things I like doing. This is the one I actually had to go someplace with it with the computer. So that's how I wound up there. Now my idea was that, okay, I know computers, I like to do film, I'll do something in the film industry. And at the time, there were not any computer graphics or anything like that. The movie Westworld was the first one, I think, that actually had some computer graphics in it, but very little. But I did find a company that was going to do some stuff with computers and with film. I went to work there, and in there I met some guy who was working at a company called Information International, which was a company in Culver City. And they were a company actually that made devices for newspapers to compose their headlines electronically, their entire pages electronically. But a side thing they discovered was, hey, we can use this machine to create animation. And when I went there and was talking to guys, or seeing what they were doing there, they were doing the graphics for a new movie. They were doing the generated scenes for the movie Tron. We got to talk about Tron, we got to talk about video games, and neither one of us knew anything about video games. And later I found out that Mattel was having an open house to hire programmers for Tron, or not for Tron, for Intellivision. And so I went over there, because I lived in the area, and just met with them. And it turned out that Disney had licensed Tron for video games to Mattel. They were looking for somebody to program it, so hey, guy walks in the door who's been over at Information International, seeing them programming Tron, they hired me. It was not my intention to go into video games. I really didn't know there was an industry there. Now, of course, you can go to school and get a degree. Has anybody got a degree in video games or studied it in school?
I do.
There we go.
I'm totally lying, by the way.
What was what?
I'm totally lying, by the way.
Ah. Okay, somebody throw him out. Pulse here. So. But yeah, people. But you're going. Here's a guy who's going to go to school to study computers, like video games. But now there's all sorts of guys. I have a friend who teaches it in a school in Texas. One of the programs, the woman who did the game Thin Ice, if you're familiar with the Intellivision game Thin Ice, she now is a professor of video games at a university in Texas. So there is now such a thing, but at the time there wasn't. So I wound up at Mattel, and at the time there were probably about 13 people, and Mattel wasn't sure that this was going to actually be a real company, be a real product that was going to last for any length of time. So they didn't want to hire anybody who was expensive. Frankly, they wanted the cheapest people coming out of school. And in hiring people, we said, well, we're not going to get the best programmers. We're hiring the cheapest people coming out of school. So instead we hired creative people who could program. I remember the guy Andy Sells came in. Andy Sells had been the piano bar player at the Tony Roma's Ribs in Santa Monica. And his wife got pregnant. He said, I better get a real job. Somebody suggested he go to Control Data Institute to learn how to program, which he did, a 6-week course or whatever, and walked in. And said, this is the type of beautiful person we want. We had another guy who had been with the Joffrey Ballet. We wanted people who were creative and could bring that to it. As my boss, Mike Minkoff, says, it's a lot easier to program somebody to be a programmer than it is to teach them to be creative. So we actually wound up a very creative group. I really look at them more as a group of artists and dancers and musicians than really programmers. Programmers kind of, for most people, was their secondary job. I was actually one of the few people, because I did continue at UCLA and I did get my master's degree. I was one of the few people there who actually had an advanced degree in computer science. But going back just briefly to where I was talking about the Mount Rushmore, the fourth person there, as I mentioned 3 of them, my fourth person there would just be kind of symbolically the man, I always forget how to pronounce his name, but his last name, Miyamoto, who created Mario. Because that's the other thing, is the software, the games, are really what's important here. And people keep forgetting that. So when the Atari 2600 was first created, reportedly they manufactured 800,000 of them for Christmas, the year it came out, which was 76, I think, or 77, 1977. And this is great, 800,000, we're going to just clean up with this. And reportedly that they did well, but they only sold 300,000 that Christmas, which started all sorts of fighting, and Nolan Bushnell left the company, and Atari announced they weren't going to make they weren't going to support the home market anymore. They were only going to do arcade machines. But one of the arcade machines that came out was Space Invaders. And they had already started the cartridge for the 2600, so they released it. And that's the game everybody wanted. Everybody wanted to play Space Invaders at home. And so those other 500,000 units went out the door, and they made more, and there were 1 million sales, and 2 million, and 4 million. And that's where, they realized, although they haven't realized it that well, is that the killer app, the software, is what you need to drive the hardware. You can have the greatest machine in the world. I always thought that the Sega Dreamcast was a nice little unit, but it never came out with the software that anybody would want to buy the machine for. Nothing was good enough to say, I've got to have that. And even like when microcomputers came out, the people who were selling them, You look at the old commercials for like the IBM PC. Oh yeah, this is going to be great. You can now store your recipes, and if 4 people are coming over and the recipe calls for 6 people, it'll tell you how much stuff you should actually buy. How many people use their computer for that? You know, nobody used it. That's not how you used it. It was like the public had to figure out and tell the manufacturers what we wanted for. For business, it turned out to be the spreadsheet, is what every company then had to have a microcomputer because the spreadsheet was so valuable. And ultimately, for home computers, it's been the web, been the internet, and then the web. You have to have one just to be part of the world today. So, but that's not what they were thinking of when they designed they designed the IBM PC. Anyway, so in late 1981, I actually started working at Mattel on the Tron game, which was great because I went out to Disney all the time and seeing the movie rushes as it was coming in. The biggest problem with that being is that I went out and they showed me something. Oh yeah, this was literally, I think, like 2 weeks before I was supposed to be finished the game. Oh yeah, these are grid bugs. What were grid bugs? They weren't in the script. The grid bugs have been added because Midway was doing the arcade machine version of it and suggested the grid bug because it would help them. And so if you watch the movie, there's a sequence that's about 10 seconds long. It's not computer animation, it's hand animation of this grid bug, and the voiceover of Yuri saying, oh, watch out for those grid bugs. If they get us, we're going to be through. It's only in there to justify grid bugs being in the Midway version. And so I said, I got to put grid bugs in my game now. So the last couple of weeks was spent, you know, adding grid bugs into my game. So it was a little bit fast and loose the way some of the stuff worked. But from the, you know, like I said, Mattel wasn't sure this was going to go anyplace. So they hired people right out of school, like say Andy Sells and Eddie Dombrauer, who've been at the Joffrey, and a lot of creative people. And but then it just started making a ton of money. They couldn't believe how much money was coming in. Mattel Toys had been making like $40 million a year. And now they had this division that like was making $100 million a year. They spun it off into a separate company late in 1981, Mattel Electronics. And it was just, again, it was phenomenal. And the company itself, they started looking and saying, oh, wait a minute. These guys don't have computer degrees. They went to Control Data Institute. We want you to hire, you know, if these people are responsible for the stocks of this company, the stock of this company, we want you to hire real programmers. So we had to hire some real programmers for when the Aquarius computer, some of the other stuff came out. And it's like, okay, we got some real people in. And they hired them in at salaries that were commensurate with that. And so that made the people who were the programmers a little bit upset. Because here the programmers are being hired for $19,000 a year, and now here these guys are coming in at $30,000 a year and have not programmed any games. And for the most part, we're nice programmers, but not really creative people. And so that started creating some tension. I've used this before. There was a guy named Joe who, at Mattel, who when I say, what was it like to work at Mattel? He said it was like, his thing was it was like living in the dorms. Because it really was. It was fun, it was competitive, it was great. But also there was always, you know, a little discord there. And that type of thing was it. The management saying, okay, you got to get some people in here who are bigger salaries. And just the tension that caused, and people who had actually designed a game that was out there, that was making hundreds of millions of dollars, and the games were out there, and you know, they were getting a fraction of what the other people were getting. So there was always some tension, but for the most part, it was fun. It was just having a great time. We have another one of the programmers, a woman named Michelle Mock, who she was a little bit older than some of the others. Most of us were like under 25 at the time. She was a little bit older. She'd been working in a couple of aerospace companies, and she likens it to being around her little brothers all the time, being there. Just people playing games and playing tricks, and the office was open 24 hours a day, and a lot of people just like practically lived there, just sort of having so much fun there. We had machines on free play, it was just great. In 1982, you do no wrong. The games were just making so much money. At the time, the marketing department was pretty much hands-off. they had made a list of games that they wanted us to have, games like this. So it's like, we need a game that's like Centipede. We need a game that's like Pac-Man. And so we come up and gave said, oh, how about Lock and Chase? That's kind of like Pac-Man. And the marketplace said, oh yeah, we can sell it that way. How about Buzz Bombers? We can sell that like a Centipede game. So there was kind of this, oh yeah, we can do that. And as long as we delivered that, they were happy. Everybody was happy. Everybody was happy. A lot of money was coming in. And the people who were unhappy because of the programs coming in more expensive, they got raises. They got big raises. So pretty soon, people who started at $19,000 a year are making $40,000, $45,000 a year. So everybody is happy, pretty much. Some people actually got unhappy though, as it became bigger, because they liked it when it was a little tiny company. And Atari was able to take advantage of that. They were able to come in and grab a lot of our programmers just because of doing a little startup, Atari Soft in Santa Monica. Atari was up in Silicon Valley. We were down in Los Angeles. So Atari started Atari Soft in Santa Monica just to get those programmers who were living down there to jump. From the beginning, there was a headhunter named Shirley. And this was a standard thing that Shirley had called and left a message, because Shirley was a very, very aggressive headhunter working for Atari. And she just wanted to talk to everybody and wanted to entice them away. And finally it worked. She got Russ Haft, who had done the game Mazatron, and then he was able to get Andy Sells and Eddie Dombrower and Mike Wyans, a lot of the other programmers we had, to jump over there. And so that discontent started around the end of 1982. Beginning of 83, I think, is when they really started over there. But 83 is when things started to go wrong. Because of the way the industry worked, and the way Mattel had worked, if something didn't sell, you could return it, get a credit, and I think get a bonus. And you could almost like return a game, and if the store returned a game, they would give you a couple new ones for sale. And a lot of the Christmas stuff for 1982 came back. So yeah, we made $100 million. Oh, well, here's $100 million we have to get back. And that really happened Christmas of '82, and the stockholder report actually says, because of a more competitive market, we see that we might have a little bit of problems in the future. Yeah. Things really started to go wrong in 1983. So in 1983, Mattel was really, because they're a toy company, I think they still looked mostly at the hardware, not so much the software. The software's kind of an afterthought to them. They're not thinking in terms of the killer app, that the software is really what's driving things. And so they were creating, already they had done the Intellivision 2. They had they were working on the Intellivision 3, the Intellivision 4. We had a voice unit, we had the ECS, the Entertainment Computer System. We had the Aquarius computer. A lot of hardware in development. And that cost hundreds of millions of dollars in development. But hey, when this stuff comes out, we're going to be in great shape. And they showed it in June of 1983 at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. And the press just killed them. Too little, too late. This computer is a joke, no one's going to want it. This stuff is just, same old stuff, nothing big, nothing new. Now the games, they got nice reviews. We had some good games come out, but just too much hardware. And so after that show, that's when kind of a big change was made. All of the top people at Intel Electronics were gone all of a sudden. Josh Denham, the president, Stafford Drummond, the vice president, all gone. And new people came in and said, we are now a software company. No longer hardware company, we're a software company. And they killed the development of just about everything in the hardware. We're just going to make games. And we're going to make games for every platform. We're going to make games for the Intellivision, for the Atari, for our own Aquarius, for the ColecoVision, for a Commodore 64. We're going to make it for whatever you got. TI computers. So they also, they created this statement, this kind of nickname called All Flavors, which meant that the game was going to be developed, it had to be for all flavors. So if you look at the end on our website, we have the Burger Time ad for 1983. And it says, now on Intellivision, coming soon for Atari 2600, Aquarius, IBM PC, Apple II, and ColecoVision. Because every game had to do that. And marketing would have preferred had it looked the same and played the same on every platform, because it was easier to sell it then. And they were only looking now at how do you sell the games. And we kept arguing, if you could do that, then you're going to be developing for the lowest common denominator, which is either the Atari 2600 or the Aquarius, which was just really bad. And at least we finally got them to agree to let us make the Intellivision games a little bit better. And it says, in fine print on the commercial. It says in fine print on the commercial, showing on an Intellivision. But yeah, so that was the theory now, was that all these games were going to be exactly the same. And marketing took a much stronger, it was no longer, oh, we need a game kind of like this or kind of like that. It was now, we bought the rights to this, and it's got to look exactly like that. It's got to be this game. And we licensed Tron, we've licensed Masters of the Universe, which you would think was easy because it was Mattel, but it was actually the worst company we dealt with license-wise. Because they were walking over from the other building every day saying, oh, wait a minute, you can't make the tongue red, and this looks too bloody. Can you dial back the red? I said, no, we have 16 colors. We cannot dial back the red. What can you do? Well, we can make it brown. Okay, make it brown. So they were constantly having us redo things. It was just a real mess. But the software was the driving thing. Now, one of our big successes was Burger Time. And Burger Time had just several things with it that just were lucky, just so totally lucky. We had a programmer there, one of our best programmers, a guy named Ray Kessner. Ray was just brilliant with programming stuff. And they had licensed the game Locomotion. And they told Ray, this is going to be your game. This is your game. He plays, I love this game. This is a great game. I want to do this game. Great, this is your game. And Ray said, as soon as I'm back from vacation, going to go over to Europe for a few weeks. Great, and I'll be thinking about it. When he was in Europe, he was thinking about it. He was kind of designing how am I going to do Locomotion. It's going to be great. Now the problem is, we had another programmer named Dan Bass. Dan Bass loved Locomotion. So he wanted to steal it from Ray. And so he was working on another game, but at night he would work on Locomotion. And so just before Ray came back from vacation, he walks in, he's got Locomotion working. I like Locomotion, so I was doing some work on it. This is Ray's game. Yeah, but I got it. So they said, well, on the one hand, we promised Ray, on the other hand, it is working. So when Ray came back a few days later, I said, Ray, got some bad news for you. And this Locomotion game, sorry, you can't have it. And he said, but I've been thinking about it. I know how to do it. Sorry, mechanics are already in. It's just got to be fine-tuned, put into it. So you can't do it. But we have this other game you might like. Now, at the time, Mattel was not going to put the money into these big, famous games. Coleco was doing that, was just walking in with a checkbook and saying, Zaxxon, we'll take that. Donkey Kong, yeah, that's good. And buying all these big things because that's how they launched their platform that came out. So there were no games really left for us to have. We just, by luck, got a couple of good ones. And one of the things that happened was that they made a first look agreement with a company called Data East from Japan. And Data East did not have much distribution in the United States. They had these machines that were called Deco machines, Data East company machines, that were unique. They actually had a tape drive in them. And you could, if you owned an arcade, you could kind of subscribe, and every month or so you'd get some of the new games from Deco that then you could put in, so you only had to buy the machine once, and then you could put these games in with the tape drive. They had a little hardware key also that made them go and you put a little new thing at the top and a new thing for plate that went over the buttons and the joystick, and voila, a new game. but it wasn't popular. Not many places had it. But we had the first look at that. So they're always coming up with new ones. And one day they invited me and Mark Urbanek, who was another manager, in to say, hey, this new game here that they sent over, it's called Burger Time. Is it any good? And because they didn't play games. So Mark and I played the game. They're watching. And after about 50 minutes, what do you think? And we both, oh yeah, we should definitely do this game. So when Ray walked in a couple days later and said, yeah, we got this game Burger Time, we think you'll like that. And he played, yeah, it's okay, I'll do that one. Now, where Mattel got lucky was, Midway said, we like that game. And they licensed it. And so, unlike the other Data East games, where I don't know how many, but very few arcades, suddenly Midway had Burger Time and they put it everywhere. Which was cool because we had a Burger Time machine on free play, and I was, among the first people in the United States to play it. And now I can go places and see the Burger Time and go and get a high score all the time. Because I knew everything, all the patterns and all that was cool. But Ray Kessner, like I say, was a great programmer, but he was getting married in about 3 months, which was the time that they were allotting for him to do this conversion. He didn't want to get bogged down with finishing a game when he was getting ready for his honeymoon and all that. So he just cranked on that thing, and in about 6 weeks he finished it. Just got it done. And he spent the rest of the time after that just watching other people play it. So he could fine-tune it. Because he had designed the game, the television has a stick chip inside. It's called standard television interface. And it can tell, like, when something is moving along and it hits a wall, hits something in the background. And it then can send a little interrupt, or not interrupt, it sets a bit that then the next time that an interrupt happens and you kind of are looking for what's happening, you say, it hit something. And now you can send it to a routine to do something like that. Well, Ray did not use any of that. He programmed it using a table, so he could say, okay, when this gets to this point, you can do this, and when this point to this. So it could all be done this way without using any of that interaction stuff, which made things move better. If you are playing the game, and if you played that game compared to some of the other games, like Night Stalker or something like that, you can tell it's easier to turn corners and faster to do stuff. And it also made it easier then for him to watch the game and say, boy, if this character got to this point a little bit faster, and these guys were here, then if you make this turn, you can get away from them and look like you really did it. And if you don't, you get caught. So he could fine-tune it. He'd see people the way they played and the patterns they were coming up with, and he could really make the game great. So I don't know if anybody's played Burger Time, but it's probably better than the arcade machine, the arcade game, in the way he did it. It was just fantastic. And then he got lucky because Mattel's policy was no royalties. There was no royalty there. But they did come up with as things were going bad in 1983, they came up with a bonus plan. You could get 6 cents for every game that was sold. And that's cool, that's nice. Well, Burger Time, when it came out at the same time the Aquarius computer came out. And if you remember the Aquarius computer, it was not a success. And very quickly, Mattel realized it was not a success. So they pulled it off the market in less than 3 months. The problem was they had bought advertising from all the networks at the time through Christmas, a huge buy of time, because this was going to be a big support on the Aquarius, big push. And they had this huge buy of time, non-refundable, so they ran Burger Time ads and all that time. So Burger Time, here was a game that just by circumstances, by Dan Bass stealing Locomotion, we got our best programmer on. And by Midway liking the game also, it suddenly is a game that people have heard of and is in arcades everywhere. And because of Aquarius being so bad, the game gets a huge advertising push. So in terms of bonuses, Ray Kessner walked out of there with the biggest bonus check ever. Actually, probably the only bonus check, because that game just did super phenomenally well. Just everybody loved Burger Time. So, but for the most part, and another thing, there's another thing that caused, the friction and all that. because as they're deciding games and who gets to do what game, well, Ray Kessner got to do Burger Time. And of course, you can make a whole lot of money off of Burger Time, while this guy got this other game that, like, that's not going to be any good. It's on the ECS, or it's a voice game. There were only 120 voice modules sold out there, 120,000 voice modules sold out there. So you can never sell more than 120,000 games of that. You have 4 million televisions, but 120,000 voice modules. They say, okay, your game's going to be a voice game. Then you know you're never going to do the type of numbers that Burger Time did. And that caused some backlash and some little riffs. So everybody was always kind of complaining. People were always out interviewing. So on the one hand, it was like the most fun we've ever had. Ask anybody who was there. Years later, it's been close to 40 years since we all got laid off, went out of business, but we still get together regularly. We still work with each other. We're all friends. It was still, just in that couple of years, it was still the greatest experience we had, and yet during it, there was always complaints. There was always one foot out the door type of thing. But it just, everything they tried doing, they laid off most of the staff. But still, hey, we're doing games. But they finally pulled the plug in early 1984. They said, no, it's not going to go any further. And so they pulled the plug and sold the rights to a liquidation company called Oglots that came in and kind of, under the name Intellivision Incorporated, liquidated everything. They hired the former senior vice president of marketing from Intel Electronics, Terry Blusky. They hired him to put together catalogs and sell off this stuff. And in some cases, some games were so popular that they actually made new copies of them. So there were a few games that actually, you'll see the ones out there in collector's thing where it says Intellivision Incorporated on the back because, all right, they had to make more of this, but they didn't have the licenses, all the licenses expired. So Major League Baseball became Big League Baseball, and from Intellivision Incorporated. So they did that, but Terry Blusky was kind of smart. He realized that as the game market went out, which it did because there was just so much glut of market, everybody said, this is making gold to get these games out there. That even though there was such a glut, and so everybody was losing money, the actual demand for video games went up in 1983. It's like 10% up. Now, supply went up like 1,000%, so nobody's going to make any money. But he did say, if there was just one company, and it was kind of, being reasonable, it could have kept going. So, am I going off this?
A little.
Yeah, okay. That would be nice, embarrassing thing. Type of thing I would do. Anyway, so in 1984, they liquidated 1985, but as it came through 85, they pretty much sold off everything. And I think they'd spent $27 million buying the inventory, something like that. But pretty much they'd gotten rid of it, made all their money off of it. So in 1985, they said, well, let's, we're going to close it down. And that's when Terry Blusky said, well, I'll buy it. And we don't know what the figure was, but less than $1 million. He bought the intellectual property and the remaining inventory and kept going with the catalogs. And now that he had the Intellivision brand, had the copyrights and everything, he then hired he got a consultant in, who then hired some of the former Intellivision programmers and started doing new games and new versions of the old games, the INTV games. Dave Warhol, he had done the game Mind Strike and Thunder Castle at Intellivision. And so he got back Ray Kessner and some of the other programmers to develop new games for INTV Corporation on a really low budget. And managed to keep Intellivision going from 1986, 85, 86 when they started doing this, through 1989. The last two games were Spiker Super Pro Volleyball and Stadium Bud Buggies. Came out in the Christmas 1989 catalog. But that was about it. In 1990, they lost so much money, they filed for bankruptcy reorganization, Chapter 7, I guess. And then in 1991, Chapter 11, and they totally went out of business, bankrupt. So, by that time, there was like 4.5 million Intellivisions out there and 125 games between us and some of the other companies like Coleco and Activision and Magic that had done games for us. So that was kind of like, that's the end, that's it. But then when the web came out, 1994, I loved it. What, I can write something, I can tell stories and just put it on the web and people can read it free anywhere in the world, which I did. And that then got a huge flow of people writing me and saying, how can we play these games again? And by that time, computers gotten fast enough, you could do emulation on the PC. Activision had come out with several packs of their 2600 games. So we looked into doing it, Dave Warhol and then Steve Roney, another one of the programmers there, we started looking, can we do this? And yeah, we could do this. The only problem was now, who's got the rights after the bankruptcy? So we did some research, and I went downtown Los Angeles, looked through the bankruptcy records and all that. And by that time, the intellectual property rights that nobody had claimed in the bankruptcy, none of the debtors were interested in it at all. The trademark, all that, it had all been returned to Terry Gillespie. That's what happens in a bankruptcy if there's assets nobody wants. And nobody wanted Intellivision. The trademarks, the copyright, nothing, nobody wanted it. So it was returned to him, and we contacted him and made him an offer, which took him about 3 months to figure, because we figured he was looking for somebody to give him a better offer. But apparently nobody did, so he came back to us and sold it to mainly Steve Roney and myself. And we started Intellivision Productions in 1997. And started first on emulation on PC and Mac. We then got an offer for PlayStation from Activision. And after that, PlayStation 2 and Xbox and Nintendo GameCube from Crave Entertainment. And in these cases, we hired, again, some of the programmers we knew from back then, Dave Warhol's company, Bill Fisher's company, Quicksilver Software in Orange County. And we have been doing this ever since. And we've done it for a lot of programming. We've done Apple, the iPhone version, the App Store. We've got Android stuff. We've been doing a huge amount of things. The latest one that we were talking about earlier is the Intellivision Flashback, where we now have a dedicated unit with the hand controllers, which is always kind of the fun thing. When we first did the games and they came out on the IBM PC, the San Jose Mercury News, which is kind of a paper that really talks to Silicon Valley. When we came out with that in 1998, they did a review, and the guy who was a reviewer there, he was talking about, this is great, this is wonderful, because the games are well done, they're emulated perfectly, and you don't have to deal with those stupid, awful hand controllers from the Intellivision. And then we also started getting from people saying, I like it, but it doesn't play the same as the original because it doesn't have those great hand controllers. So this has been a problem that I've had since we started the company, is that half the people want those hand controllers, and the other half of people hate those hand controllers. So this has the hand controllers. And to me, it's like, that is the true experience. So you love them or you hate them. If you've gone onto our YouTube channel or you've had Intellivision, you've probably seen the clip with Gallagher talking about video games and stress and everything. He's saying, stress, he takes electromagnetic, he destroys an Intellivision because of the stress it causes. And then afterwards he says, no, it's not the game, it's the controllers. And he does a special thing in just destroying those hand controllers. But for better or for worse, that is probably the major thing of this new flashback, is you have the games, and for the first time you can really have the full experience with the original hand controllers. Anyways, that kind of brings us up to today, where we're actually selling this in our booth inside, although we sold out today, but we can still sell, we can still take orders. Anyway, that's kind of the history on everything. So now we have plenty of time for questions and answers. what do you want me to talk about, or what do you want to know? Any questions? Let's start over here. Question?
So, tell me what a typical development cycle was like on the Intellivision, like how long and what were the steps?
The standard was considered 3 months, although more realistically it was about 5 months. But some games, like I was the manager of a game called Thin Ice, and it really was 3 months. It was remarkable. Now, part of that may have been that during that time I was in France training programmers over there, so I wasn't in charge really during the time it was being. But Julie Hoshizaki, who did a wonderful job and did it in the 3 months. Most of the games took a little bit longer for various reasons, being, they have voice, and so there's that voice development and all that. Some of the games, simply because of weird things and maybe the programmer is not being adept at the particular thing that game required, took over a year. We had a game called Pinball, one of the earliest games announced for the Intellivision. We had a program worked on for 2 years, and never really got it to the point where it really was working at all. And then we hired a new programmer and said, his first job was, can you see if you can actually make that move along? And together, they got the thing out then in like 3 months. So it was just a case, and that happens in some other games where somebody else had to be brought in to kind of help finish it off. But essentially 3 months. And the budget for the games was really kind of taken from when they were doing the games. The original games were done through an outside firm, APH in Pasadena, because nobody knew how to program a video game, and nobody knew, certainly at Mattel, nobody knew how to do that. They had to find a company that did know how to do that, and even though they'd never done video games, this was a company, APH, their specialty was embedded software. So if you had a satellite going to Mars, or you had a washing machine that had to have a computer in the program, that's what their specialty was. And they figured that's what a video game is. And they did a very great job, like on the sports games and stuff, because a sports game is perfectly defined. You know what baseball is, you know what football is, you know what the rules are. So you know if they wound up doing it right or not. I believe that the games that we did that were creative games, probably had a little bit, the APH people said, oh, we were always better at programming. So, well, I think you were better at programming games that had the perfect definition, but creating a new game, I don't think anything they did compares with like Gabe Warhol's game Mind Strike, which is a totally new game. But anyway, APH was getting paid about $30,000 a game. So that's kind of what they budgeted game development, is 3 months and $30,000. The cycle of the game was kind of deciding what we're going to do, whether it was on the marketing list. Well, we need these sports games. We need we need a game that's like this game or like that game, and then deciding it. Going back to the killer app for Intellivision was the sports games. The sports games were that's what really got us going, because we had George Plimpton, sports writer, coming in, and this was unusual for the time, to actually walk in and say, here's this company's game, and here's our game. And at the time, the Intellivision cost $300, and the Atari was less than $200. So it's like, why should they pay that much more money? And of course, the kids aren't paying it. That type of money, which was it's like $800 today. The dad's paying that. Mom and dad are paying that. And when no one knows what a video game is, no one knew what a video game was, here's a commercial where a sports writer comes in and says, here's Atari Baseball. Now, Dad may not know what a video game is, but he knows what baseball is. And he sees that and he goes, that's not baseball. And then he sees our game, Major League Baseball, from the Intellivision. He says, now he sees a diamond, and he sees people running around, and he goes, that's baseball. So that's what got the sales going, was the guy who had to buy it, they aimed it at him. And that's actually something that comes about from Mattel. Mattel's theory always was, it was a marketing company making games for kids, but kids don't buy games. So the game had to be fun for the kids to play. but there also had to be something in it that appealed to the parents. And the same thing happened with these games. Say, okay, this has got to be for the family. So we had educational games. We had this. Unfortunately, they learned very early on, all people really cared about were the graphics. And so that's what Mattel kept hitting your head over the head with. This game is better because the graphics are better. It's better because of the graphics. Look at that game, look at this game. It's the graphics. And that made it very easy then for Clico to come in. Clico would say, graphics, right? That's what Mattel said. Look at our graphics. Because they had higher resolution graphics. They didn't do anything original. Almost every game, I think, every game they did was either a sports game or racing game, or else was based on an arcade machine. And they just opened up, they backed up the Brinks truck and to every arcade company and got all the top licenses. So they weren't doing anything original, but they were doing stuff that is, you know, what the kids wanted. They wanted the arcade games. And these are games that the parents recognize the names of. Even if a parent doesn't go to an arcade, still know what Donkey Kong is. And I used to eat at the Love's Barbecue on Hawthorne Boulevard in Torrance, and in the lobby when you walked in, there was a Donkey Kong machine. And so the parents know what a Donkey Kong is. They know what Pac-Man is, they know what all these, they know the major games, even if they didn't go to an arcade, because those games were also, at that time, they were everywhere. Every place you went, there was an arcade machine sitting in the lobby of every restaurant. And so they were able to go in there on that basis. So at the beginning, it was fun. Like I say, marketing was kind of hands-off. We kind of did the game and then finished it and said, here it is, and then they went out and sold it. But as 83 came around, things became a little bit more, software is important, and we want to be in charge of it. Then they were kind of testing everything. You would do something, and they would take it to the mall and grab people and say, what do you think of this? And it became a little more constrained and not as much fun. But 82 was a lot of fun. 83, not so much. That answer the question?
That's a pretty good start.
Start? Okay, what else do you want to know?
No, let somebody else.
Okay, all right. Who else had a question? Okay, question right here.
I was wondering if you could speak to the television cable system. I don't know if you were involved at all.
The cable vision?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the thing was, we were based on the General Instruments chipset. And General Instruments said, oh, well, we got a big one on the line here. So every time General Instruments did anything, they tried to sell it to Intellivision also. The voice chip was General Instruments device. It was made to, it was made for cars to say the door is ajar, the window is down, or something like that. They said, yeah, we can adapt that to video games. It didn't adapt very well to video games. You only do like 30 words. We were writing scripts, and like, and then trying to say, okay, we got enough space for 30 words in this game. How do you make that then work? Anyway, so one of the things that General Instruments did was they had a division, which was the Gerald division, Gerrold, that made cable set-top boxes at the time. At that time, if you had cable, you had a little box that had a sliding thing there, and you slid it over to channel 30. And that's it. Like I say, it was made by Gerald. And they came up with this idea that they sold Intellivision on, that we can download the games to an Intellivision using a interface that is essentially memory. So here's a 4K memory thing, block, you plug it in there, and now over the cable wire comes these games, 30 games a month, whatever it was, and then you can play them. There was just two problems with that. One is the game started getting bigger, and it could only play the games that were like 4K. I think actually it had probably do 6K, because I know it had some of the games. Some of the games we did, like Dungeons and Dragons, was 6K. But it couldn't do as the voice games came in and stuff, it couldn't do that. It couldn't do the later games where it got to be 12K, and then we started doing 16K games, and you couldn't do that. And the second thing was, that they discovered, is that smart people started hooking up computers to that and started creating their own games. Started to figure out how to download, upload games, disassemble them, figure out how they worked, and then create their own games and put it back in. And they didn't want that. So they killed the whole thing. But yeah, it was the first real, hey, here's your game, downloading it. Wasn't streaming, of course, wasn't real time, but still, I think they did either 15 or 30 games a month. And they would send you a little packet with the instruction books and the overlays in it. You had to buy your own Intellivision. But yeah, it was a great system. It was actually very much ahead of its time. But it came about because of General Instruments trying to sell everything to Mattel that they could. Hey, how can we get them to buy something else? Yes. But I never heard how many cities actually, they advertised it, it was a big thing, they treated it like a real deal, but I don't know if they really considered it more than test marketing. I don't know how many cities it wound up and how many cable systems it wound up on, but Mickey Mantle did our commercials. I wanted to play baseball. Later, Mr. Mantle, playing Astro Smash. Is there more you wanted to know about it? Or?
No, that's great.
Okay. But yeah, so the Gerald company actually made it, but they molded it to look like part of the Intellivision, so you could just plug it in and then hook it up to your cable, and boom, there you got it. Okay, you had a question.
Oh, yeah, what was the software development environment for the Intellivision like? Did you only did everything in assembler, or did you have to do any higher level language or anything like that?
No, it was on the assembly language for the 1610 processor, which is very similar to the assembly language for the PDP mini computers. It was designed to be that, in fact. So they could hire people who were PDP developers and they could come over to it. But no, at the time you couldn't do any higher level language. We tried at the very end experimenting with C, but we found that, I think the figure was about 85%. They had to go in and do some chopping off to get it down to that size. We probably would have gone to that in the future, and C became more efficient after that. So we probably would have gone to that had the company lasted another year. But yeah, Steve Roney, under my supervision, was the first to experiment with higher level languages, and C was the choice. But it just didn't happen. We worked on time-sharing computers, mini computers, digital equipment compatibles, but they weren't really, they were knockoffs made by the Andromeda company. But they were designed to be like a digital equipment mini computer system. And later we got VAX computers in, which were digital equipment computers, mini computers. And the company APH, who had been the ones who did the initial design of the operating system for the Intellivision for the initial games, they did the compiler, the linker, and all that type of stuff. Or the assembler, really. It's not a compiler. They did the assembler and the linker so that we could program on those systems. They did use Unix on the VAX machines, but we used a language that was specifically for the assembly, so it's like we're writing the assembler for the 1610. It's hard, especially when you got 4K. Yeah, let's do this great game and 4K. Yeah, entire sound effect now is more than 4K. You got a question back there?
Can you talk to the QA process or the quality assurance process?
The QA process?
Yeah.
The QA process was interesting because at the beginning, QA process was essentially the other programmers played the games and found the bugs. And that worked great, except as the pressure became more and more, games got pushed more and more and hurried more and more. And the game B-17 Bomber was kind of that was the last straw as far as the corporation was concerned, because they had been working, B-17 Bomber had been promised for a long time. John Soule had been programming it for over a year, and it was no really closer to being a game. It was a great simulation of flying a B-17 Bomber, but there was no gameplay really in it. So when Steve Roney and Bill Fisher finished their game Space Spartans, Mike Minkoff, who was the boss of that division, said, "Can you help John Soule finish it?" And so they worked another 6 months, and then they got it pretty much working. And the vice president, Gabriel Baumgartner, said, "Okay, we've got another week. Next Friday, it has to be sent to the plant in Arizona, owned by General Instruments, that will burn the print." Well, we're not quite right. No, you don't understand. It will be sent. next Friday. So they were working 24 hours a day, trying to get it done, trying to push it. And that same weekend, I was getting married up in Truckee, California. And that Friday, my best friend from Chicago flew in, picked him up at the airport. And I said, hey, you want to see where I work? And I took him back and took him up to see the programming department there and showed him around and said, oh, and here's a cubicle. These are my friends Steve and Bill, and they've been working on this B-17 bomber game. And hey guys, this is my friend Chris. Do you like video games? Yeah. Would you play this? Okay. And he sat down and played it for half an hour while they watched. And at the end they said, thank you. And they took the game then and burned the EEPROMs and sent it to Arizona and burned the game. Made it, sold it, finished the game, sent the game out. That was the testing. When the game was then 3 months later, when it was actually finished in the production run of 50,000 or whatever they made, probably 100,000, Steve Roney took a copy to his dad, who plugged it in and played it within 5 minutes, crashed the system. Completely hung the game. And the reason he hung the game is because the Intellivision has an operating system called the exec. And half of the exec is a programming loop that says, here's how things are going to happen. You're going to check this, you're going to check that. If there's an interaction between this, then you will call whatever routines have been written. And then everything you write is a subroutine to that loop, the main loop. And then the other half of this exec are useful routines. One is a tracking routine. If you've got a spot, you got something that's you got an object that's at this point on the screen, and you want to go there, calculate the velocity and all that and make it move. And if you've got multiplication, 1610 chip can't multiply, can add and subtract. But here's a multiplication routine that you can use. Here's a division routine you can use. Well, it turns out, something that Steve and Bill and John didn't know, is the tracking routine uses the division routine. And it doesn't check, it requires you to check. Could you be tracking something that's going to cause that routine to divide by 0? If you drop a bomb from high enough up and close enough to an edge, it's going to divide by 0. And if you divide by 0, in Intellivision, brain explodes, and it stops. And Steve's dad found that very quickly, and so did a lot of other people out there playing. And people were complaining left and right about this. And I think at the same time, a game called Royal Dealer came out, and they found all sorts of problems with that. Luckily they found those before the game was released, so they could put in an errata slip that said, oh, by the way, when it says to shuffle, look at your cards after, if you do that, the game will crash. Don't do that. So they had to put several pages of don't do that into the instructions for Royal Dealer. Anyway, because of that, because of B-17 Bomber and Royal Dealer, the word came down from on high, we had a QA department that tested these games, that could test the game, but they didn't do for a game like B-17 Bomber, they never looked at it. They found the problems in Royal Dealer, they found them after the game was in production, but before it was released and published, they could actually put the instruction books right, but the game itself they couldn't change by that time. So, the word came down from on high, no game goes out the door until the QA department signs off on it. And the QA department was 2 or 3 people. The one we dealt with mostly was a woman named Tracy Glouser at the time. She married a guy named Ray Rue, who was in our IT department. But she just essentially played games all day long with a VCR going, so that if she did it, she could then go back to the VCR, find out what it was, and reproduce it, so that once she was comfortable that if you do this, this happens. And then she would call up the programmer, with great glee, I would say, also. I was supposed to be sent to France and England to hire programmers for our French office. And I think it was supposed to be like on October 15th of 1982. And my game had to be finished before then, Tron Solar Sailor. And she kept finding bugs up until the day before I left. And I would be sitting in my office and I get this call, and, hi Keith, it's Tracy. Is the solar sailor supposed to sail off the beam and go off the edge of the screen when you do that? No. So, as I remember, I had named the original ROMs I gave for Tron. And then I did Tron X, and then Tron Y, Tron Z, Tron XX, Tron YY, Tron ZZ, and I think Tron XY was the one that finally worked, because each one represented a bug fix. And luckily, it was like 2 days, she signed off on it before I had to leave. So I made the flight to London in time. But yeah, once, we had a lot fewer bugs once they said it will not go out. I can't think of a game, in fact, that actually has a bug in it afterwards. But yeah, many of the early games did have bugs. Went out that way. And that created a little bit of a problem a few years ago when we sold the rights to our PlayStation 2 game. The Crave had the rights in the United States. We sold it to a European company to release it in Europe. Now the problem is, the way games work now, the reason why there was the crash in 1983 is because anybody could make a game for these platforms, for the Intellivision, for the Atari, for the ColecoVision. But if the game was a hit, they didn't have to give any money to those companies. Well, they're making the hardware these games are running on. And so it's like, as these companies made more money, or took more money out of the market because you have now so many other players in it, the people making the hardware aren't making as much money. And so the whole thing crashed. When Nintendo came along, they came out with this, hey, let's make it this way that only games that we've manufactured can play on Nintendo. And the Xbox and the PlayStation are the same way. So anybody can make a game for PlayStation, but you have to pay Sony like $10 a game copy to manufacture it for you. Now some people say, isn't that illegal? Wouldn't that be like restraint of trade or something like that? But I don't think anybody has ever really pursued that in the United States because nobody wants to mess with the system. The system, everybody's making money right now, don't mess with it. But in Europe, somebody did sue. And I think in Europe, their system is a little bit different. And they can't quite they don't have as much control over it that way. But they still do have control just in terms of if a game meets quality standards. So what happened was, since they couldn't quite, when the game went to Europe, Sony, for the PlayStation 2, Sony in France, they couldn't say, oh, we don't want this game because we don't want an old game on our system, which we get a lot of feedback. Most of these systems will not let us be on the first year because they don't want an old blocky 1980 game on their nice brand new spanking new 5 billion polygon system. So they couldn't stop us for that. So they really nitpicked and they rejected it because this game B-17 Bomber, it crashes. You have to fix it. Well, so first of all, I don't know if we can fix it because we don't really have the facilities to go in and change that. And so the company was like, what are we going to do? What do we do? So I wrote a letter to whom it may concern. And I made the comment that the fans of these games expect the games to be perfect duplicates of the games that originally were in the 1980s. They want to play the same way and look the same way and sound the same way. And if there's a bug in the original, they want that bug in the game now. And then I said, to fix a bug like that would be like going into the Louvre and gluing arms on the Venus de Milo. And that's it. That's what. Okay, all right, you're right. we see what you're talking about. After that, Paris, France said, okay, yeah, we get it. And they let us do it, and they released it. So, but I think that covers most of what you're talking about with the QA. It was kind of weak up until mid-1982 with B-17 Bomber and with World War II. And after that, it was pretty good. It was excellent.
Every time you fixed a bug, did you need to like reburn another
Yeah.
copy?
Yes. Yeah, there was a mistake because the systems we had, Now, the VAX was later, had the VAXs in there, they were a little better in terms of, they could put a terminal down where Tracy was. But in the time sharing ones we had, once you had a version of it, there was a station, a cubicle station, on each one of the time sharing systems. We had 7 or 8 time sharing systems. You then burned EEPROMs and put them into these things called T cards. And then that was the prototype thing that then could be taken down to Tracy to play the game. So yeah, the other systems, the Atari, the Coleco, you could burn an EEPROM and stick it into actually you could just go and buy a ColecoVision cartridge and unsolder it and solder in an EEPROM or solder in a socket to put in the EEPROM, and it'll play it. But the Intellivision has a weird addressing scheme that requires latches, it requires paging, knowing which. It's built into the GI ROMs so that they know which. They know their own identity. So when you say, I need something from 8075, you shoot that down the line, and all the EEPROMs all get that information, but the one that's 8000 knows, I'm 8000, and returns the right information from its location 75 is what goes up then. So all of that stuff requires the T card filled with other components. So when you look at here's a prototype ColecoVision game, there's one chip. Here's a prototype Intellivision game, here's 15 chips. So yeah, it had to be burned each time and then put into the sockets and then taken down to her and said, here, Miss Gloucester, please enjoy this game and anoint it with your wholesomeness. And she was meticulous in this. She would call you down and then show you the tape and show you exactly what happened so you could kind of figure out where the problem was. And we have those records from her. We have a huge thing, so we can go through and find exactly what it was that she was approving and what she was disapproving. We have all of that. At the time, we had hardware that was built by APH called a data widget, which allowed you to set breakpoints to single step through games, so you could get right in there and find these bugs. So they got pretty adept at finding things, because it's not like today where you can download a patch, game goes out, we made 100,000 of them, that's it. And if you make a mistake, you got to throw away 100,000. Came very close to throwing away 50,000 block and chases, because we would put our names just in ASCII. So if anybody disassembled the code, they would see this was programmed by Keith Robinson or whatever. Actually, the real reason for it was they wanted the copyright from Mattel to be in the ASCII for each game, and would so add our names in also. Copyright 1982, Mattel Incorporated, programmed by Keith Robinson. When Mike Winans did the game Block and Chase with graphics by Peggy DeCarli, and I think Josh Jeffrey did the music. At the end, the final thing he did was, alrighty, copyright 1982 Mattel, programmed by Mike Winans, graphics by Peggy DeCarli, music by Josh Jeffrey. And he said, I'm done! And he invited Josh and Peggy out to lunch. And at lunch, he discovered something. Peggy DeCarli's last name isn't spelled the way he thought it was. He thought it was small d, small e, large C. No, it's spelled capital D, E, small c. And he goes, oh, I didn't know your name was spelled that way. So he goes back into his office, back in Intel, and he fixes that in the ASCII code, and fixed it. What he did not realize is that Bill Fisher, who was kind of in charge at that time, keeping track of the games being sent out to be processed, had run into his office and had burned the EEPROMs to send to the factory in Arizona to make the final ROMs. And so when the ROMs came back, 50,000 ROMs, they come out with a checksum, which has to match the original games. They get the archived games on the discs that were in Mike's office, and the checksums don't match. checksums were wrong. They ran it several times completely wrong. The ROMs manufactured do not match the game as it was archived. And by that time, Mike Winans had left our department and was working in the design and development department himself. But Bill Fisher tracked him down and said, Mike, is there anything you can think of that would cause this problem? And he thought and said, I changed the spelling of Peggy's last name. They took the archived copy, changed the spelling, and the checksums matched. Saved 50,000 copies of the game. But so sometimes things were a little bit sloppy, things weren't quite, in the early days when it was more fun, things were a little bit looser. But yeah, once in middle 1983, that wouldn't have happened because everything was very closely tracked and monitored and records kept. That answer that about QA? Okay. Yes.
Did Mattel also own Sega? Eventually? No.
No? Why?
I don't know who owned Sega.
No,
Sega?
Suppose it's all planned.
Sega stands for Service Games. It was started by an American who was in Japan, in Tokyo, after World War II, when a lot of Americans were stationed over there, just kind of, keeping the peace. And he had a company where he would bring pinball machines over. And so the pinball machines would be marked Service Games. They got reduced to Sega. So it's an American company in Japan initially, but since it's been bought out by Japanese. And the only thing about Sega and Mattel is that when we laid off everybody, the few programmers who were remaining, they said, okay, we guarantee you, if we lay you off, we'll give you 3-month severance. So we said, hey, that sounds good, we'll stay. And then 3 months later, they laid us all off, and we got 3-month severance. And one guy, Steve Tatsumi, he went out, and he got a new job at Sega. That then, like a month later, laid him off. So he was actually collecting severance from Sega and Mattel at the same time.
I think the reason why I thought that is there's an earlier panel by the author of Console Wars, and
Oh, yeah.
the executives at Mattel was
Yes.
hired to work at Sega.
Oh yeah, the guy who was originally the president of Mattel was working for Sega.
Oh, okay.
But there was no relationship that I know of, maybe some friends. And it might have been, like say, the head guy goes over there and maybe hires some other people he knows. But that certainly happened. The guy who, after Josh Denham, who was the president of Mattel, after they ejected him after the CES of 1983, when everything was kind of so disastrous, they hired a new guy named Mac Morris. And Mac Morris had worked for Teledyne Waterpik, and suddenly all of the marketing people were Teledyne Waterpik people. So it's like, yeah, you're bringing your own team. So I imagine that's just what happened. But there was no direct connection that I know between Mattel and Sega.
So, what were things like at Intellivision when ColecoVision put out their Intellivision add-on thing? What was the response for that in the office? Or like, did anyone care? Or like, oh,
Well,
we need more people buying our games now? Or
no, the thing about, I don't believe that ColecoVision announced it, and other companies announced it, but nobody, I don't think, ever released it. I don't think there is a ColecoVision add-on, because the problem is that unlike an Atari, because Intellivision released an Atari and so did Coleco, an Atari add-on that could play the Atari 2600 games, is that an Intellivision has an operating system. And whereas the courts found that you could make an Atari 2600 yourself out of hardware, you could not copy an operating system. Unless you really reverse engineered it. And people today don't really understand what reverse engineering is. They just think uploading something and disassembling it is reverse engineering. Reverse engineering is you have to essentially shoot bits of information into a thing and then figure out from what's coming out of it what it does. And if you then start programming for it, you have to be able to prove, and the burden is on you to prove it in court, and you have to provide all the records so that anybody else can duplicate that you figured out for yourself how the thing was made. So as far as I know, nobody actually did create a device to play the games because they would have had to figure out how to duplicate the deck. And it's something that even to this day, you'll see the people who do emulators of the Intellivision, they will warn you that you have to get the exec.bin and grom.bin files because they can't provide them, they can't put them in the emulators because we own the copyright on that. So even to this day, you know, if you look up one of the emulators, you'll say, you got to find these files. And then, of course, other people bootleg them. You won't have to look very far to find them, but the people who put the emulators up won't put those files up. So I don't believe that anybody ever actually did an Intellivision. And also, we announced we were going to do a ColecoVision one, and that's why I know about this, because we couldn't actually do the ColecoVision one, because ColecoVision has an operating system. You've got an operating system, you're pretty much hosed. Yeah, that was the thing, was the Intellivision, the IBM PC, people had to figure out the BIOS for that, and that had to be done very carefully. Now, we were able to do games for Coleco, like Steamroller that we released later, because there was a company, I think they were in Washington State, that their specialty was reverse engineering. And they would sell you for like $500,000. Here's the manual for programming Coleco. Here's the manual for programming Intellivision. Here's the manual for, and they would reverse engineer these operating systems and tell you how you can program for them. And by doing that, you were protecting liability. If you were sued by one of these companies, you could say, this company up in Washington, they gave it to us. And then they were willing to go to court and prove. And so it would let Intel off the hook. One time we had one of our programmers just uploaded and disassembled a ColecoVision game. And said, hey, look, I figured out how to do this. And the lawyers came down on him like, we can't do that. Luckily, they had intended to, and they'd already bought they didn't know it, they'd already bought the manual from this company. So they could get away with it because we paid these guys some time, the $500,000. I still have that ColecoVision manual. So I could program games. Yes?
Do you remember at all what the name of the company was? Because the manual sounded like
I don't, but remind me to look in the files and find that ColecoVision manual, and then we find out what it is, see if that company's still around. Yes?
My question was on Steamroller. How did
Yes.
you acquire that?
When we first put the company together, we just started looking for the old programmers, and got in touch with Dave Wolf, who had worked at APH, and he was the first Intellivision programmer. He wrote the exec, he wrote the operating system, and he wrote Major League Baseball, and wrote them simultaneously, because he always said, you can't write the operating system without a game, you can't write a game without the operating system, so we run both at the same time. And so I talked to him about it, and I said, hey, do you have anything unreleased? And he said, well, I did do this game for Activision. And the thing was that Activision, the programmers at APH, the top programmers bailed and started their own company called Cheshire Engineering. They bailed to form their own company and offered their services to everybody else. Now they offered their services to Mattel, and I still have a thing from Gabriel Baum telling executives, we should hire these guys. They're the best of the best of APH. Let's get them working for us. But Mattel wouldn't do it. So they went to work for Activision. And the game Dreadnought Factor and Wormwomper were done by the APH guys. And this other game was an Intellivision game called Steamroller. But then as everything crashed in 1983 and Mattel announced they weren't going to support the Intellivision anymore, they said, well, can you switch that over and make a ColecoVision game? And so we made a ColecoVision game. But then by the time we finished it, Coleco announced they weren't going to support the ColecoVision anymore. So here they had a game that no one had ever seen. Now we were just making a deal with Activision for them to be able to put our games on the PlayStation 1. So when I was negotiating the contract, I put in there, well, we will take $10,000 off if you let us have the Activision unreleased games for us to put out. And so they put a limit on it, I think 1,000, 2,000 of them. So okay. So we sold about 500 of them, I think. Not a big deal, but we did take that, we did take the ROM image that Dave Rolfe still had in his files, and we just burned it into an EEPROM and started making the games. We got an award for that, by the way. One of the first awards supporting classic gaming, because we came out with Steamroller. And it's a great game.
Yeah.
I would love to see that one translated back into Intellivision. We might find one of our programmers who wants to do that. For the Intellivision Flashback 2.0. You buy enough of these, maybe there'll be an Intellivision Flashback 2. Yes, we're having to wind it up soon here, but anything else? Don't want anybody to be unhappy. Yes?
How did you choose the games for that flashback?
Well, essentially, the thing is that they wanted 60 games. And when you look at our number of games, for the games that don't have a license involved, we can't do the Data East games. We can't do the Disney games. We can't do Locomotion. We can't do, so a lot of those games we can't do. And then they didn't want to put both the 1-player and 2-player sports games in there. So ultimately, you add that up, you come to about 60 games. I think it comes out like 61 games. We, just because of last minute things that come up, we had to leave out Reversi and Skiing. But we had the unreleased game, so let's put Takeover in there. Let's put this game in there. So it came out right to about 60. So I was actually kind of amazed when I actually added it up. Hey, it comes out 60 games. That's perfect. That's how. And
Is there going to be like DLC or add-ons?
SD card.
There are games that I want that are not.
yes, one of the problems is there are lots of things that people at this convention would love to have. There are not as many people out there. There's not enough people here to make that worthwhile. But what I'm hoping is that we do a 2-point version. We might be able to do some. The problem is it's got a very small circuit board inside. It's very, very economically produced. I would love it though if they could put some holes and traces on a circuit board to allow people to mod it, to add an HDMI and to put a cartridge port and to do that type of thing. It'd be great. But I don't think you're going to see the manufacturer add games to it because frankly, you are not the demographic for this thing. They got to sell 500,000 of these things or 1 million of these things. There's not that many people here. And people say, why isn't there a cartridge thing? Well, we're not selling it to the people who still have a collection of Intellivision cartridges. The people we have to sell it to don't have that. We're trying to introduce it to people. Maybe they'll go out and buy that stuff. And you still can go buy it in Intellivision, you still get all the add-ons for that. So, so I apologize, I would love to see this stuff. But there's also a reality. We were saying earlier, you can't, I think it was Winston Churchill said, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is a great system. It's not perfect, but it's great. Anything else? Yes?
Which model of the Intellivision is your preferred version? 1, 2, 3.
Probably the Sears Super Video Arcade, because it is a version of the first one, but with removable hand controllers. But it's got the same side buttons and the domed number pad. See, when they did the 2, the side buttons became hard plastic and are very horrible. Absolutely awful. And the Intellivision 3, when INTV did it, they went back to the original design, but not the domed buttons on the keypad. They're flat. So you want the 1, but if you, with the problems that the hand controllers do have, it's nice to have the removable hand controllers. And the hand controllers on this, with a slight modification, will work on your Intellivision too, and your Sears Super Video Arcade. So if you had a Super Video Arcade and you need new hand controllers, you just get one of these, and And there's a cable that the guy sells for like $10, and it converts it so it can play. Okay, I think we've hit the time. Well, okay, we'll sneak in another one here.
Fast question.
Okay.
Can you say how much you paid to buy the rights from Terry Pileski?
I'm not allowed to,
Okay.
but it was less than 100,000. But
Okay.
that's really all I can say. We're not allowed to give any details out on the Pileski contract. It's in the contract. We don't want him showing up and slapping us around. So. But I think I can give the general ballpark figure of that.
Awesome.
Okay. I think I'm supposed to go outside so you can actually, if you're interested, we have things you can buy and I can autograph. We've run out of the flashbacks here, but we still have these special limited edition sleeves. Only 250 of these sleeves were done. 200 of them were sold at Classic Game Expo. We had 50 here, and I don't know how many we have left, but not many. Yeah, less than 30. And then we have the T-shirts, like the Still Blocky After All These Years T-shirts. The Astro Smash shirt that you see monthly on The Big Bang Theory. Sheldon wears this. And if you watch the pilot episode of The Flash, the character Rico is wearing this. And then the exploded hand controller. This is actually from the service manual with a hand controller, which Emily is, stand up, Emily. Model that beautiful. It's the beautiful shirt, beautiful shirt. And we'll have them right outside here. So
Thank you so much for being loyal Intellivision fans.
one more thing. Please come to our site, sign up for the game club. Go on Facebook, like our page, because when one of the great things about this product, company At Games, they've done the flashback, they've done the for Atari, they've done it for ColecoVision now, done that. We are the only company they can come to as one-stop shop, because we're the only people who are still hold the rights and who was part of the original company. So when they're doing stuff now with these companies, they have to deal with like 3 or 4 different companies that put it all together. But with us, it's like it's a little bit simpler. But anything we can do that shows them, hey, the number of people we got here, then lets them do. Okay, we'll do a 2.0. We'll do another one. We'll do this. So you do that. You want to see other stuff on there. Sign up so they can see how many people are going to be getting our
Without
information.
you guys, we don't have products, so
Yeah.
thank you.
So Keith, did At-Will Games, did they come to you or did you go to them?
We actually had an agent who put us together.
Yeah.